It was a long, arduous crossing of the Atlantic. The year 1620, 400 years before our present day. There is no electricity, no engine, only the sails and stars. Passengers on board suffered fates of illness or death along this 2-month voyage. Delayed by a leaking ship which never reached its final destination, Pilgrims, as they were called, set forth on the Mayflower into a vast ocean, hoping to obtain a place to enjoy the freedoms they had lacked in Europe. Anchoring at the tip of Cape Cod in what is now Provincetown, Massachusetts, on November the 11th, these pilgrims enacted the Mayflower Compact, a social contract establishing law and order in the New World. For these travelers had missed the site of their original charter, thus having no sanction to settle. In the name of God, amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God, of Great Britain, France, and Ireland King, defender of the faith, etc., having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith, and honor of our King and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering, and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices, from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. These are the words of the Mayflower Compact, the first written establishment of self-government in the colonial period of North America. It was a year before the Pilgrims would celebrate the feast that became known as Thanksgiving, and though their passage was not easy, the winter months to come would prove even more challenging. The story of Thanksgiving is one that's been mangled and forgotten in recent years, which certainly in part comes with the passage of time. We're simply so far removed from the days of our forebears, we don't understand the day in which they lived, so it's difficult to picture what their life and their plight might have been like. So I've wanted to put together my own version of this great story of history, of American history, and relate it back to today. The Pilgrims were a group of what we call religious separatists, a collection of Christian denominations that developed out of the Reformation, composed of those ideological purists who couldn't bear to remain within the Mother Catholic Church. There were Puritans who, as their name indicates, wanted to purify the church from within, and did have measured successes. Then there were the separatists who not only broke off from the Catholic Church, they saw the Church of England as spiritually depressed and left it to become their own sects and congregations. The Pilgrims were among the separatists, Calvinistic in a lot of ways, but they desired a more democratic or congregational church. They were a peculiar bunch, that's for sure. Maybe it's part of why they didn't fit in so well in Elizabethan England of the 16th and 17th centuries. From the beginning of the 80 Years' War, aka the Dutch War of Independence from Spain, spanning from 1568 to 1648, French-speaking refugees began to populate the town of Leiden, Holland. The Pilgrims at the time lived in Scrooby, England, close to Nottinghamshire. And at the time, under Queen Elizabeth I's rule, attendance at unofficial or non-state churches was punishable by fines, imprisonment, or even execution. They were openly persecuted by the early 1600s and didn't see much relief when James I took the throne in 1603. You can see why purification was the more popular path to reform, but to fully cover that aspect would require the context of more than 1,000 years of church-state relations. However, King James, who united the thrones of England and Scotland peacefully for the first time, did inherit the laws under which the persecution took place. In practice, however, he exercised some religious tolerance, at least before the Gunpowder Plot, which was the third conspiracy against him in just 3 years. Afterwards, he went after the Catholics, but later again softened his stance. He was also something of a reformer himself in that he zealously defended his own faith and wrote religious tracts. Then again, this king had 2 men burnt at the stake for heresy, and a Baptist leader named Thomas Helwys died in prison after appealing to James I for a sort of separation of church and state. These were the last men to die in such a manner in England, and I think that is significant. So by 1608, our Pilgrims had packed up and moved to Holland in search of a place where they could practice their beliefs in peace and maintain their identity. First, they set down in Amsterdam, which was the home of several other separatist groups already. It was also home to other religions, and that fact led the group to the second largest city in 17th century Holland, Leiden. Here they would live and work for nearly the next 12 years. Now, one thing I wanted to know, or didn't know I wanted to know until I saw it was a thing, and then I wanted to know it, that was in Leiden, the Pilgrims worked in a variety of occupations, due in part to permissible guild regulations. So what did they do? Roughly 1/2 of them worked in the cloth industry, which was thriving there. There were also tailors, hat makers, glovers, hosierers, shoemakers, carpenters, block and tackle makers, twine makers, leather workers. Now that would have a different meaning in today's Amsterdam, wouldn't it? Coopers, cabinet makers, masons, watchmakers, mirror makers, tobacco sellers, tobacco pipe makers, merchants at large, and of course, the lowly yet important midwifery. At their height in Leiden, the Pilgrim numbers climbed to about 300. With such wide-ranging occupations and prospects and freedom of religion, it seems almost puzzling what would have driven these wandering people to leave their new homes and venture even further, thus earning their eponym Pilgrim. Some of these wanderers already lived in the city before leaving England, but many came from farms, and like today, not everyone favored that adjustment. There was also a language barrier for older Pilgrims, while their kids began learning to speak Dutch. Fearing loss of identity once again, along with an outbreak of riots leading to government censorship, they searched for a new home once more. In 1617, one of the founders of the Virginia Company and an outspoken critic of King James, Sir Edwin Sandys led negotiations with the Puritans in Leiden, resulting in the Pilgrims obtaining passage on the Mayflower and Speedwell. I didn't know about Sandys either, but get this, he was the son of the Bishop of York, whose seat was in none other place than Scrooby, where the Pilgrims started out, and the family of William Brewster, who became one of their leaders, rented the bishop's manor. Brewster wrote to Sandys asking for help to get to the New World. Only one of the 2 ships would make it, as you may already know. The Speedwell was an old refit warship, plagued by leaks and never left Europe. In fact, only about half the Pilgrims themselves would make it to America, the rest electing to stay in Holland. They sailed from Delfshaven, Holland to Southampton in England. Then when departing at Southampton, the Speedwell began to leak, forcing them to divert to Dartmouth for repairs. They left again in late August, but 300 miles out to sea, the Speedwell again began leaking due to the stresses from carrying a larger mast and sail, and both ships returned back to Plymouth. During one of those storms, it is said that when the main beam of the ship cracked, a printing press for Bibles was used to secure it. 55 days after finally leaving England and Europe behind, and thrown off course by the storms, the Pilgrims spotted land. They were too far north of their charter destination in Virginia, and when they sailed southward, they ran into rocky waterways. This was another delay they could not afford with the winter coming, and Captain Christopher Jones meant to sail back to England before it set in. He didn't get this wish fulfilled, finally leaving on April 5th the next year. As a result, this is why the Pilgrims set foot first at the tip of Cape Cod, then settled at the mainland spot they called Plymouth. Since their charter couldn't apply, being in completely the wrong location, this is why the Mayflower Compact was chartered. It established true self-governance in the American colonies for the first time. Jamestown, the first permanent American colonial settlement, was founded in 1607 and had an early representative government, but Plymouth was a new thing. They didn't leave with permission from the king to settle where they did, but they did submit themselves to the crown nonetheless. The first winter for the Pilgrims was unthinkably difficult. They had only the local natural resources to build their first homes and establish a sustainable community. In fact, many or most of the inhabitants spent the winter months sheltering on board the Mayflower. A few passengers didn't survive the voyage, dying of disease or exposure, but the oncoming winter would claim more than half the lives of those who remained. Edward Winslow was a man who helped organize and secure financing for the trip. He traveled with his wife, who survived the winter but sadly died in the spring in March of 1621. Edward remarried the widow, Susanna White, whose husband died in the bitter winter, becoming the first to marry in this new land. Around the same time, Winslow forged a positive relationship with the Wampanoag tribe, who taught these fledgling Pilgrim colonists what they needed to survive. The story goes that after at least one other visit by Native Americans, Massasoit, the leader of the Wampanoag Confederacy, was joined by 60 armed men who stared down at the colony from a nearby hill. Winslow was sent up, along with some gifts to offer and the salute of King James of England with love and peace. Talk about political gamesmanship. Thus began formal peace negotiations. They actually established the longest peace treaty with native tribes in American history, lasting more than 50 years. Squanto also famously helped negotiate among the tribes. Interestingly, the spot of Plymouth, Massachusetts, was an abandoned native or Indian village, as they called it at the time, formerly named Pawtuxet. A Wampanoag tribesman who was sold into slavery in 1614 in Spain made his way back in 1620 to discover the whole village had been wiped out from plagues. The ground was, and still is, thought to be haunted, and with its 2 springs and a nearby river, this made prime real estate for the taking. The Pilgrims had a far less friendly encounter with natives when they first ventured onto land at Cape Cod, actually firing upon them at what's known as the First Encounter. So maybe for more than one reason, they got to keep this land to themselves. You might even call it Providence. Governmentally, Plymouth was set up mostly according to the original charter and had a similar form and function to that of Jamestown. They had a common system of working and sharing produce. This led to discontentment in the camp. Quoting from The Colonial Experience, a history book by Clarence B. Carson, able-bodied men complained that they did the work but received no more than those who did little or none. The older and more experienced were reduced to the same level as the young. Moreover, wives were expected to wash the clothes, dress the meat, and serve in such ways all the inhabitants. This was more than the women or their husbands could gladly tolerate. In consequence, Governor Bradford began to allow families to have their own crops in 1623 and parcel out some of the land in 1624. Much fuller division was accomplished when the Pilgrims in America bought out the London financiers of the project. For this reason, as well as the harsh winter condition and the timing of their landing, these small in number religious adventurists needed any help they could get from the outside. Due to the fortunate or providential encounter with Massasoit, the Pilgrims received exactly that help, learning how to farm and tend the land, and that same year in 1621 experienced a bountiful harvest. Almost as unthinkable, given the circumstances, as surviving had been that first winter. And on October 21st, 1621, the two groups sat down together to share in a feast, of which Winslow later wrote this: "Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, that so we might after a special manner rejoice together, after we had gathered the fruits of our labors. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl, as with a little help beside, served the company almost a week, at which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and amongst the rest their greatest king Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted, and they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor, and upon the captain and others. And although it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God we are so far from want, that we often wish you partakers of our plenty. And so in this way, a tiny, tight-knit community with trust in God, seeking a life of opportunity and freedom, became pioneers, etched into the national story of the United States of America.